They share one body, two spines, two hearts, two completely different personalities. And for over 30 years, the world has watched them, but never truly understood them. Abby and Brittany Hensel became famous before they were old enough to choose it. Millions assumed they knew their story. But the part that never made headlines, the quiet, private reality they've been living since the cameras stopped, has been hidden for years. And it changes everything. On the morning of March 7th, 1990, in Carver County, Minnesota, a delivery room fell quiet in a way that nobody had expected. Mike and Patty Hensel had just become parents. But what the doctors saw when Abby and Brittany arrived was something most of them had only ever read about in medical textbooks. Dicephalic parapagus twins. Two heads, one body. A condition so rare that it appears in roughly 1 in every 189,000 births worldwide. There are only a handful of documented cases in recorded medical history where both twins survive past infancy. Abby and Brittany were already defying the numbers before they had taken their second breath. The doctors were honest with Mike and Patty almost immediately. Surgical separation was possible, technically, but the anatomy made it nearly unsurvivable. The girls shared a torso, a pelvis, a single rib cage, and one complete set of lower organs. 2 legs, 3 kidneys, 2 arms, 2 spines that merged at the base. To separate them would have meant giving everything to one, and almost certainly nothing to the other. In most scenarios the surgeons described, neither girl would have made it off the table. That was the decision Mike and Patty Hensel were handed on the first day of their daughters' lives. They said no, not out of denial, not because they didn't understand the medical reality in front of them. They said no because they looked at what was there, 2 living girls, 2 heartbeats, 2 sets of eyes already open to the world, and they chose to let both of them live it. Most people have never heard the full story of what Abby and Brittany's parents were told the day they were born. Did you know separation was offered and refused? Tell us what you think about that decision below. We read every comment. What made Abby and Brittany's case extraordinary wasn't just survival. It was the specific way their bodies had formed. Each girl controlled one side. Abby, on the right, operated her right arm and right leg. Brittany, on the left, controlled her left arm and left leg. 2 separate nervous systems, 2 separate brains, sending 2 completely different sets of signals, both of which had to reach the same body at the same time. Neurologists who studied their case described the coordination required to walk, to reach for something, even to clap, as something that had no real medical explanation. It simply should not have worked as smoothly as it did. But it did. The early months were hard. There were surgeries, not to separate, but to correct. A third arm, partially formed, was removed. Spinal adjustments were made. The girls were monitored closely. Every milestone came with a question mark attached. The doctors said surviving infancy would be the hardest part. They had never met the Hensel family, and they had no idea what these 2 girls were quietly becoming. Here is what most people get wrong the moment they first see Abby and Brittany Hensel. They assume that sharing a body means sharing a mind. That somewhere between 2 heads and 1 set of legs, there must be one dominant personality calling the shots while the other follows. It is a logical assumption. It is also completely incorrect. Abby and Brittany are 2 separate people in every measurable sense. 2 brains, 2 nervous systems, 2 distinct personalities that developed independently from childhood and have never stopped being different from each other. Abby tends to be more outspoken and direct. Brittany is quieter, more reserved, more likely to let a moment sit before responding to it. They disagree. They negotiate. They occasionally frustrate each other. They are, by every psychological definition, 2 individuals who happen to occupy the same physical space. The physical differences between them are just as real. Abby runs warmer. Brittany's body temperature sits lower, which means she often wants an extra layer when Abby is perfectly comfortable. Abby's side of the spine grew slightly longer, making her a few inches taller than Brittany when measured individually. Their shoe sizes are technically different. Even their hair, their posture, and the way they hold their respective side of the body reflects two people making two different sets of constant, unconscious choices. And that word, unconscious, is where the science genuinely runs out of easy answers. Each twin controls one arm and one leg on her side of the body. To walk, both signals must fire in coordination. To pick something up with both hands, two separate brains must agree on timing without stopping to discuss it. To swim, which they do, to run, to type, to drive a car, which they learned and both passed licensing exams for separately, two independent nervous systems must operate as one without either twin consciously directing the other. Neurologists who have studied their case describe this level of involuntary coordination as something that does not fit neatly inside any existing medical framework. There is no clean explanation for how fluidly it works. It just does. What that reveals about identity is harder to sit within the biology. Because if two people can share a skeletal structure, share organs, share every physical resource a body has, and still emerge as completely different human beings with different tastes, different moods, different senses of humor, then the body is clearly not where identity lives. What Abby and Brittany make visible, without trying to, is that who a person is runs deeper than anything a surgeon could ever separate. Most people spend a lifetime assuming their sense of self is tied to their physical form. Abby and Brittany dismantle that assumption just by existing. Two completely different people. One life to schedule, one career to build, one world that wasn't designed for either of them. And they were about to walk into it anyway. Abby and Brittany Hensel were 6 years old when the world decided to own them. In 1996, Mike and Patty Hensel agreed to a feature with Life magazine. The intention was measured, a single story told carefully on their own terms. What happened instead was that the images traveled further and faster than anyone in that family could have anticipated. Within weeks, Abby and Brittany's faces were being discussed in living rooms, newsrooms, and medical conferences across multiple continents. They were 6. They were in first grade, and they had just become 2 of the most recognizable children on the planet. What followed moved quickly. An appearance on Oprah, then a second one, a TLC documentary that drew millions of viewers, magazine covers, interview requests from outlets in countries the girls couldn't have found on a map yet. By the time they reached their teenage years, the volume of public attention surrounding them was something most adults would have struggled to process. Abby and Brittany were navigating it while also navigating homework, friendships, and the already complicated work of growing up. But here is what their parents refused to let the attention change. Mike and Patty Hensel operated on a philosophy that the people closest to them described simply as radical normalcy. The girls attended public school in New Germany, Minnesota, the same school, the same classrooms, the same teachers as every other kid in their town. They had chores. They earned their own, spending money. They were expected to meet the same standards academically and socially that any other child would be held to. Fame was something that existed outside the front door. Inside it, they were just Abby and Brittany. That boundary held at home. Outside it, the world pushed constantly against it. Strangers approached them in public without asking. People took photographs, sometimes from a distance, sometimes uncomfortably close, as if documentation was a right that curiosity automatically granted. Online forums, even in the early days of the internet, hosted long threads where anonymous users dissected their anatomy, debated their future, and discussed their bodies with a clinical detachment that had nothing clinical about it. These were children being treated as a subject, a case study, a conversation piece for people who would never have to live with the consequences of that conversation. What that pressure does to a person, let alone 2 people still forming their sense of self, is not something that shows up in a documentary. It accumulates quietly. It shapes how much of yourself you choose to share, how carefully you move through public spaces, how early you learn that the world's curiosity and the world's respect are not the same thing. Abby and Brittany learned that earlier than most. What happened next in Abby and Brittany's lives is something most viral summaries completely get wrong, and it matters. If you want the full picture, not the headline version. Make sure you're subscribed. This channel goes deeper than anyone else. They had survived the attention. They had graduated. They had built something that looked from the outside like a normal life. But what came next was the moment that split public opinion completely in two. In 2012, Abby and Brittany Hensel walked across a stage at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and collected their degrees in education. Not one degree between them. Two, because they are two people, and they had each done the work to earn it. What came after that moment is the part of their story that most headlines summarized in a single cheerful sentence and then moved on from. The real version is more complicated, more human, and far more worth paying attention to. After graduation, both Abby and Brittany sat for their teacher licensing exams. Separately, Minnesota law recognizes them as two distinct individuals, which meant two separate certifications, two separate legal identities entering the workforce, and immediately one genuinely unresolved question for the school district that hired them. Were they one employee or two? The answer had real consequences. Two people meant two salaries. One body meant one classroom presence, one schedule, one set of hours logged per day. There was no existing policy that covered this. No precedent. No guideline written by anyone who had ever encountered this situation before. The Mounds View School District had to make a decision in territory that had never been mapped. Reports at the time indicated they were paid a single salary to start, with the understanding that compensation would be revisited as their career developed. It was a compromise that not everyone agreed was fair. But Abby and Brittany accepted it, showed up, and got to work. Because the work was the point. They were hired to teach 5th grade math at Mounds View Elementary School, a room full of 10 and 11-year-olds who, by most accounts, adapted far faster than many of the adults around them. Children have a way of accepting what is in front of them when nobody has told them yet to be uncomfortable. The students learned. The classroom functioned. By the measures that actually matter in a school, it worked. But outside those walls, the conversation was harder. Some parents had questions. Some had more than questions. The idea of an unconventional presence at the front of a child's formative classroom triggered exactly the kind of debate that Abby and Brittany had spent their entire lives being the subject of, people deciding from a distance what was appropriate for a situation they weren't actually inside. If you've ever had to prove yourself in a room that wasn't sure you belonged there, you already know exactly what Abby and Brittany walked into every single day. Their story isn't just about being different. It's about what it costs to keep showing up anyway. And they kept showing up. That is the fact that gets lost in every simplified retelling. They were not making a statement. They were not performing resilience for an audience. They were doing a job they had spent 4 years training for, in a community they had chosen because it was what they wanted to do with their lives. The most radical thing Abby and Brittany Hensel ever did was refuse to be extraordinary about it. They had the job, the classroom, the life they had built on their own terms. Then a single social media post, one they had nothing to do with, changed the conversation entirely. In early 2023, a piece of information surfaced on social media that stopped millions of people mid-scroll. A marriage certificate, reportedly public record from Hennepin County, Minnesota, indicated that Brittany Hensel had married a man named Josh Bowling. No announcement had been made. No interview had been given. No statement had been released by anyone in the Hensel family. The information simply appeared, the way public records sometimes do, and within hours, it had traveled to every corner of the internet. Abby and Brittany said nothing. What happened next revealed something that had very little to do with them and everything to do with the rest of us. Comment sections filled within minutes. Some responses were warm, genuine well wishes from people who had followed their story for decades and felt something close to real joy for them. But those were not the responses that dominated. What flooded alongside the congratulations was something uglier and far more familiar. Questions about the physical logistics of their relationship, framed as curiosity. Debates about what Abby's experience of the marriage would be, discussed as if she were not a person, but a variable in an equation. Jokes, speculation, detailed, public commentary on the most private dimensions of two women's lives, typed out and posted by people who had never met them and would never have to answer for a single word they wrote. 30 years. That is how long Abby and Brittany had been in the public eye by the time this moment arrived. 30 years of interviews handled carefully, of media appearances managed on their own terms, of a life built quietly and deliberately in a small Minnesota community where they were known as teachers and neighbors and people, not subjects. And in the span of a single news cycle, none of that careful, decades-long boundary drawing mattered at all. The question this moment forces into the open is not about Brittany's marriage. It is about the assumption that made the reaction possible. At what point does fascination become ownership? Because what poured into those comment sections was not curiosity in its innocent form. It was the behavior of people who genuinely believed that because they had watched Abby and Brittany grow up on Oprah, on TLC, in Life magazine, they had earned some claim to the parts of their lives that had never been offered. That attention paid over time converts into access. That familiarity is the same thing as permission. It is not. It never was. Abby and Brittany had spent their entire lives giving the public exactly what they chose to give, and nothing more. Every appearance was a decision. Every interview was a boundary drawn. The silence that followed the 2023 reports was not confusion or embarrassment or an inability to respond. It was the same choice they had always made, expressed in its clearest possible form. They owed no one an explanation. They offered none. And the discomfort that created in millions of people who felt entitled to one is perhaps the most honest reflection this story has ever held up to the public that followed it. They never confirmed it. They never denied it. And in that silence, after a lifetime of being watched, they had finally said everything. Pull back far enough from any story and the details stop being the point. The delivery room in Carver County in 1990. The Life magazine photos in 1996. The Bethel University graduation in 2012. The silence in 2023. These are not separate events in a biography. They are one continuous answer to a question the world kept asking in different ways. Who gets to decide what a life is supposed to look like? Abby and Brittany Hensel never wrote a memoir. They never gave a TED Talk. They never built a brand around their experience or monetized their story into a platform. In an era where visibility is currency and personal narrative is product, they did something that almost nobody with their level of public recognition has chosen to do. They lived quietly. They worked. They protected what was theirs to protect. And they let the life itself be the statement. That restraint is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. Because what their life makes visible, without a single press release, without a single motivational caption, is something most people spend years trying to articulate and never quite reach. Identity is not a body. Autonomy is not the absence of limitation. And the most powerful thing a person can do in a world that wants to define them is to simply keep being themselves steadily and without apology until the world runs out of ways to argue with it. That is what Abby and Brittany did. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently across 30-plus years in a small Minnesota town where they coached sports, graded papers, and went home at the end of the day like everyone else. The assumptions their existence challenges are not small ones. They touch identity, privacy, bodily autonomy, the ethics of public attention, and the difference between celebrating someone and consuming them. Most people who watched their TLC documentary or read the 1996 Life feature did not walk away thinking about any of that. But it was always there, embedded in the story, waiting for whoever was ready to look at it directly. The lesson was never really about Abby and Brittany. It was always about what happens inside the person watching. Whether fascination tips into respect, whether curiosity learns to recognize a boundary, whether two women who never asked to be symbols end up becoming ones anyway. Not because of anything dramatic they did, but because of everything quiet they refused to give up. They came into this world on someone else's terms. They built the rest of it entirely on their own. Abby and Brittany chose silence over spectacle, and that choice says more than any interview ever could. If this story made you think differently, there's another one on this channel that will hit just as hard. It's about another pair of lives the world misread completely, and what happened when they finally stopped explaining themselves. That one is next.